I started college near the end of the Vietnam War. I entered my freshman year in 1971. It was at a time when the United States was drafting people to go to Vietnam. College students in the previous several years of America's involvement in Vietnam had received student deferments, which meant that as long as they were students, as long as they were enrolled in good standing in college or graduate school, they wouldn't be drafted. The argument was that it's disruptive to their lives and we'll draft them after they graduate, which meant, of course, that if you did graduate, then you were liable to be drafted, which is one of the reasons a lot of people went to graduate school in the 1960s and early 1970s. It's also one of the reasons that professors found themselves sometimes torn by conscience in giving students grades. A student had to maintain academic eligibility. If you flunked out, then you lose your student deferment and off you go to Vietnam. Now, at the time I didn't think much about this. Later, when I became a college teacher myself, it did come up. I was teaching at Austin Community College when I was in graduate school. And as a community college teacher, I had students who came from all over. And I had one young man who was from Iran. This was in the 1980s. And Iran was then at war with Iraq. It was a very bloody war. And this guy was in one of my classes. And he was not a good student. He was not a diligent student. He seemed to take his classes very lightly. Well, until the end of the semester, because at the end of the semester he was about to fail and he hadn't done the work, and so I was going to give him an F, a failing grade. And he came into my office and he pleaded for another opportunity. He pleaded for me to bend the grade curve down so he could pass. And I said, you haven't done the work. Why should I pass you? Because, he said, if you fail me, I'm going to be kicked out of school and I'm going to be sent back to Iran. And if I'm sent back to Iran, I'm going to be drafted into the army. And the soldiers who are drafted into the army, they get killed at very large rates. Do you want to have my death on your conscience? And when he put it that way, I was thinking, well, maybe I should give him some extra credit or something to give him the last chance. But I have to say that I was torn. In the first place, I was a little bit suspicious of his story. He did appear to be Iranian. I mean, from all that he told me in our few brushes before, he was from Iran. I didn't doubt that part. But I do know that you don't flunk out of school simply for flunking one course. So if he was going to be kicked out of school, he must be flunking nearly all of his courses. And so it wouldn't be just on me. But having said that, I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll do something. But then he did something that basically made me decide, no. Because then he said, he took out his wallet. And he said, is there anything that I can do to help you make up your mind? And when he was starting to offer me a bribe, I said, no, sorry, get out. And after, no, what I said is, get the hell out of here. And I gave him an F, sort of at that point, in good conscience. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he was just, telling me a line, and maybe all that was going to happen is his dad was going to give him a slap on the wrist or something, and he'd have to go to work or something like that. I don't know. And maybe he did, in fact, get sent back to Iran. Maybe he did die in one of the big ground battles in the war. I don't know. But I put the question, I raised the question because this is something that professors and college teachers had to deal with in the 1960s and 1970s. And a lot of them were, they didn't like it. They were kind of torn by the idea. In many cases, by no means in all cases, but in many cases, they were skeptical of the war itself. And so the idea that someone would be compelled to go fight a war that was either unwise or unjust or something didn't match with them. And so there were stories that I had heard. I can't vouch for this from personal experience. There were stories that people would give students just I mean, in the old days, there was something that was called a gentleman's C. If you were enrolled at Harvard in the 1920s, if you just showed up, you got a gentleman's C. Well, there was something that was the equivalent, sort of the Vietnam C, where you get a C simply for enrolling in a class because we don't want you to have to go to fight that war we don't agree with. Anyway, but in my case, by the time I got to college, this idea of a student deferment had run its course, and the student deferments were being ended. And I think there was a good argument for ending the student deferments, because what it really meant was that college kids, or that the kids who themselves could afford to go to college, or their parents could send to go to college, that group of people, by and large, didn't go to Vietnam, at least not right away, whereas poorer kids and kids who didn't have the college opportunity, they went off and fought. So that didn't seem fair. So they ended, in the Nixon administration, they ended the student deferments. And what they then went to is a lottery. And so I recall, I was a freshman, and the lottery took place, I believe it was in the spring of 1972, so that's sort of the end of my freshman year. And I remember walking around the campus on the day when the lottery was being held, and it was nationally televised. And so what they would do is they had two big containers of ping pong balls, or the equivalent, and one of them had numbers 1 to 366, because 366 days, they had to include leap years. And the other one was the dates of the year, so August 1st, whatever it was. And I believe it was the director of the selective service system, the draft board, would reach into one and reach into the other and match them up, and they say, okay, January 13th, 297. Well, what that meant was that if you are 297 out of 366, given the state of the war and the direction of American mobilization in Vietnam, you weren't going to get drafted. On the other hand, if they pulled up May 23rd, and they pull up number 17, number 17 out of 366, you're probably going to get drafted, you're going to go to Vietnam. And I remember walking around the campus, and I would hear sometimes cheers coming out of the windows of dorms. And the cheers presumably were for the young men, or maybe from the friends of the young man, because in these days the draft was all male. And presumably these people got a high number because they were happy they weren't going to be going to Vietnam. I should add, by the way, that the people who did want to go to Vietnam, they didn't wait for the draft, they went enlisted. So all the people who were listening in on the draft part, they were ones who did want to go to Vietnam. Anyway, so you'd hear these, and then, by contrast, you would hear occasionally people you'd hear coming out of another window, oh no, which presumably meant that they got a high number, 16 or 2 or something like that. Anyway, so this was the state of play in 1972. In my case, I got a number, my number was 95. And 95, this was in that gray area, because it looked as though they might very well be drafting up to around number 100. And in fact, in due course, I got a letter from the draft board saying, okay, you need to show up at this place at this time for your draft physical. So I did. And I went and I got my draft physical, and it's an assembly line physical where they just, they go through you just to make sure you're not falling over dead and you don't have any sort of gross heart abnormality. And they also do these mental tests where they make sure that you can recognize patterns and stuff like this. And so there it was. I passed the test, and I just had to wait. And the question is, so am I going to get drafted? And the numbers were announced. Okay, first of all, we're going to draft people from 1 to 25. Okay, you guys, you're going. Show up at this particular base for basic training. And then they go from 25 to 50. And then they got sort of further into the year and say everybody up to 75. I thought, oh boy. Because if they do it by 25s, I'm in the next batch. But in fact, that year, they didn't go beyond 75, and I wasn't drafted. Okay, so I did not serve in the military in Vietnam. I came fairly close to, but I didn't. But then, having gone to this lottery and gone to this ending of the student deferments, what the Nixon administration did subsequently was to decide to end the draft entirely. And so as of 1973, there has been no draft, no military conscription, that's the formal name, for telling people, okay, you gotta go, you gotta serve, and if you don't, we're gonna send you to prison. So this has been the state of play with the American military and American military service now for nearly 50 years. And it's a fair question, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And one way of looking at it is in the context of, well, it's a history class, American history, of course. American attitudes toward the military. In particular, I'm going to focus on the Army. And the reason I'm going to focus on the Army, or more precisely ground forces, is that the Navy is in a different category. And the Navy is in a different category for two reasons, fairly briefly explained. One is that navies require time to build, whereas to train a soldier, especially in the early days, when pretty much everybody knew how to use weapons, training wasn't much at all. You basically take somebody who uses his rifle to go hunt, and you say, okay, use your rifle, often your own rifle, and now you're going to go shoot enemy instead of shooting deer. So it wasn't that big a deal. And furthermore, being a soldier wasn't particularly complicated in those days. So the training for ground troops took very little time, and it was easy to do. But training for the Navy, it's a different thing, because not everybody's a sailor, but actually more importantly, you gotta have ships, you gotta build ships. And this is a basic point to keep in mind, especially for people who've been born since 1945. All of you, me too. Until 1945, the United States did not have a military establishment during peacetime to speak of. The United States, Americans basically thought that spending money on armies and navies was a waste of time, a waste of money. And because it came from people's taxes and they didn't want to spend the taxes. And furthermore, Americans fancied themselves a peace-loving people. We don't want to be one of those militaristic countries like Europe. And so we're not going to have a standing army. That's the term for an army that exists even in peacetime. What the United States had was wartime armies, but come the end of the war, the soldiers would be sent home. Bye-bye. Go back to your farms. Go back to your blacksmith shops. Go back to your banks. Go back to all your other stuff. We don't want you around during peacetime. We don't want you around for two reasons. Number one is we don't want to pay you. If soldiers are in the army, they got to be paid. We don't want to pay you because when we're not using you. And secondly, we don't like the idea of underemployed soldiers, because underemployed soldiers are simply a temptation to officers to use those soldiers for purposes we don't like, namely taking over the government. So other countries go back to the Roman Republic, and Julius Caesar took over the government by force of arms, and we don't want that to happen in the United States. So Americans had this aversion to peacetime armies, standing armies. Again, when the war starts, then we'll rev up, we'll muster a lot of people in. As soon as the war ends, get rid of them. So there's that. And, so those are two reasons for not having a standing army. Navies were a little bit different because you can't just build ships overnight. You have to have them ahead of time. And so, the other thing is, so Americans were willing to tolerate peacetime navies, but nowhere near what the United States would have after World War II. In fact, a lot of the naval battles in American history were fought by private ships that were re-outfitted and recommissioned as, well, usually they're called privateers. So basically licensed pirates, and they go prey on the ships of the enemy. But the other reason was that whereas you can take an army and you can march the soldiers up the steps of the Capitol and take over the government, you can't sail the ships up the steps of the Capitol. You can't take over a government with a navy. So navies didn't represent that threat to self-government the way that armies did. Okay, that's background. So during the Revolutionary War, the armies were, actually there were two kinds. There were state militias, and these are the armies of the states. And it's important to remember that in those early days, the 13 states were independent countries, and very often their chief executives were called presidents. So Benjamin Franklin, I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin some years ago, and people would ask me, so why was Benjamin Franklin never president? And they meant President of the United States, but I would answer by saying, actually, he was 3 times president. President of Pennsylvania. That's what the chief executive, in effect, the governor of Pennsylvania was called in those days. But anyway, so Pennsylvania had its army. It was called the militia. And these were part-time soldiers. They were all prepared to defend the colony and then the state, if need be, but they didn't do that when the need didn't exist. So in the Revolutionary War, there were militia, and then there were soldiers who were part of the Continental Army. This was George Washington's army. And so there were these 2 categories of soldiers. The ones in the Continental Army were kind of more professional, but not always. And Washington fought with combinations of these, and sometimes the state militias, who were controlled, by the way, by the governors of their state. So George Washington could ask the governor of Pennsylvania to send militia. He couldn't order the governor of Pennsylvania to do that. George Washington was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, which was controlled by the Continental Congress. But the Continental Congress relied on the states a lot. So the United States always had this patchwork of armies. And this was the case during the First War, the Revolutionary War, then during the War of 1812, same sort of thing. And after the Revolutionary War, after the War of 1812, the soldiers were sent home. And in each case, the government relied on, well, mostly on the patriotism of the young men who were going to take up arms. There were sometimes enticements paid, so there would be bounties. If you join the Continental Army, we'll pay you this much. And they did get paid. So even if there was an assigning bonus, we're going to pay you this much per month. Now, it's true that in the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress is slow to pay. One of the things they did, though, was to give soldiers plots of land. So we'll give you 80 acres or 100 acres or 400 acres, depending on your time served. And this was a good way of transitioning from the army to peacetime, because now you're the owner of a farm and off you go. So it was during the Civil War, the Civil War, that the government felt obliged to compel people to join the army. And this was only 2 years into the war. Before then, Abraham Lincoln on the side of the North, Jefferson Davis on the side of the South, appealed to the patriotism of soldiers. Come defend the Union. Come defend your state in the Confederate States of America. But after you've run through the enthusiasts of the volunteers, then if you want to keep fighting, you have to compel people to go. So the Union government instituted a draft, a conscription, in 1863. And the immediate response was riots in American cities, especially in New York. And in New York, there was a week of, it could only be called sort of urban warfare. There was an uprising against the draft. And it demonstrated that drafts in the United States are unpopular. But sometimes they have been thought to be necessary. So that's the Civil War. The Spanish-American War required no draft. It was short and relatively simple. But there was conscription in World War I. There was conscription in World War II. By that time, Americans got used to the idea of a draft. In the Civil War, Americans weren't used to the idea, which is why there was this uprising. There were actually draft riots. There were protests against the draft in World War I, to a lesser degree in World War II. But there still was some opposition. But even opposition aside, there was an understanding on the part of most people that the United States is playing in the big leagues now. These are big powers, the most powerful countries in the world the United States is dealing with. And America needs to bring its power to bear. And an argument in favor of the draft, that is, compelling people to serve, was that if you don't do this, then you invite freeloaders, or the economists who call them free riders, people who gain the benefits of having their freedom defended, having their property defended, having their lives defended, but at no cost to them. And Woodrow Wilson was a good Democrat, with a capital D, but also a small d Democrat, and he, in general, didn't like the idea of compelling people to do that which they would not choose to do. But in the case of the draft, he was asked, well, doesn't conscription sort of violate your fundamental principles that people ought to be able to choose what to do? And he defended on grounds that the government of the United States, America's elected officials, had chosen for all the people what to do, namely to intervene in the war in Europe. And so he said that this was just sort of enlistment en masse, that the country has decided that we're going to go to war, and therefore all people of military age and capability are going to be part of this. So that was the draft in World War I. There's a draft in World War II. The draft in World War II, by then people were used to it, and the idea that you owed, that any citizen, and we're still talking about male citizens regarding the draft, that the government was doing something for you, you need to give something back. And so the concept of, yeah, a draft, it was acceptable. And there was one other aspect of the draft that was important. This was true in Vietnam, it was true anywhere there was a draft. If you have a draft kind of in the background, then you encourage people to enlist ahead of getting drafted. Because if you enlist, then you have some control over where you will go and what you will do. And so if you wait around to get drafted, then you're at the mercy of where you get sent. And so people would join the Navy, for example, during the Vietnam War. They'd enlist in the Navy before they got drafted in the Army. Because the thinking was, well, probably not going to get killed in the Navy because North Vietnam doesn't have much of a Navy. The Navy provides support for the ground troops and the airplanes that fly over Vietnam. But you know, in the Navy, the argument about the Navy is you've always got your own bed to sleep in at night, and especially in that war, you weren't under fire from the enemy. So the draft, even if you're not drafted, the draft can have an influence on enlistments. But one of the things that the Vietnam War demonstrated, there's a draft in the Korean War. Again, people were used to it, and all right, this is just part of being an American citizen in this 20th century. In Vietnam, Vietnam really tested that principle because the war in Vietnam lasted so long. Americans were used to short wars. The Revolutionary War was an exception to this. The Revolutionary War began in 1775 and didn't end until 1783. However, the fighting was done by the end of 1781, so it was a little bit shorter than it seems. But anyway, that was the war for America's very existence. But other wars, the War of 1812 lasted 2.5 years. The war with Mexico, there was no draft for that one either. That one lasted 2 years. The Civil War lasted 3.5 years. And World War I, American participation in World War I lasted 18 months. World War II for the United States was 3.5 years from the end, well, basically the beginning of 1942 to middle of 1945. So it was a little bit shorter. The Civil War was basically 4 years, almost 4 years. And so these were relatively short wars, but the war in Vietnam went on and on. American troops started arriving in Vietnam in the early 1960s, and in the early 1970s, they were still there, and witnessed the fact that I was potentially going to get drafted in the early 1970s. And Americans have shown a willingness to support wars that don't last too long. Winning wars that don't last too long. And America's wars weren't all winners. The War of 1812 was basically a tie, and the Korean War was a tie. America's other wars were winning wars. But in any event, the wars didn't last that long. But when wars go on and on, then, understandably, America started thinking maybe this war wasn't such a good idea. And then you get to the point where the people who are going to be drafted if the war continues, they have an incentive to do something to see that the war doesn't go on forever and ever. And so it was the very group that was about to get drafted along with my group that was involved in the most vigorous, in some cases violent, protests against the war in Vietnam. And this was those college students who knew that if the war was still going on when they got out of college, or as it turned out, when the student deferment was ended, then off they would go. And so, it's no accident that the biggest protests against the war in Vietnam were on college campuses, because the college students, they had, well, their skin in the game. And here there was a close parallel between the anti-war protests on college campuses in the 1960s and early 1970s against Vietnam, and the anti-draft riots in New York in the 1860s, so 100 years before. This because the people who were rioting, who were protesting, were ones who were going to get drafted and sent off to potentially get killed. And there's nothing like having your head in the potentially in the crosshairs of an enemy, to concentrate your mind on, is this war a good thing? Is this something that our country ought to be doing? If you yourself are in a position where you're not going to go off to war, then it presumably is easier for you to make the decision, in favor of war. And this was an anomaly. I won't say it's an anomaly because it's actually common practice, but it was this facet of the war decision-making process that really has irked people a lot over the generations. And it's this in particular, that it's old folks, I don't say old, people of my age, people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who make the decisions for war. These are the presidents of the United States. These are members of Congress. And these are people who are not going to get drafted, who are not going to go fight. What these old folks say is to the young folks, you go fight. And what would it be if the young folks had the opportunity to make the decisions? Then maybe the decisions would be different. And in fact, it's this that gave rise to the amendment to the Constitution that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Because there was this gap. You could not vote until you were 21, but you could get drafted at 18. And a lot of people during the decade of the Vietnam War said, well, this isn't right. If this war is going to be on and I might get killed in the war, I ought at least to have a vote. I ought to have a right to have my say. And so, in fact, this is when the voting age was lowered to 18. Some of the people who were protesting actually wanted to have the draft age raised to 21 so they wouldn't be so liable to get drafted so soon. But in fact, it went the other way. But it's all part of this idea that if your life is potentially on the line, then you're going to think very seriously about this war, and maybe you'll make a better decision if you're involved. Maybe the country will make a better decision if you're involved than if you're not. So, the draft ended in 1973, actually almost at the same time that American ground participation in the war ended. The war in Vietnam finally ended in 1975 with the defeat of the government of South Vietnam, the country that the United States had been supporting. So it's an American defeat in Vietnam. And there has not been a draft ever since. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? On the face of it, you might say it's a good thing because a draft requires people to do something they wouldn't have chosen freely to do. Because if they had chosen freely to enter the Army, they would have enlisted. They didn't have to be drafted. And especially in a government that prides itself on individual liberty and democracy and all this, people shouldn't be compelled to do stuff unless there's a very good reason for compelling them to do it. We compel people to pay taxes because otherwise they wouldn't pay taxes, and governments couldn't provide the services that people have voted for. But compelling people to join the Army, it's sort of like, well, it's not exactly like slavery, but people have likened it to that because you are not in control of your fate, and furthermore, you could easily get killed. And so people shouldn't be required to do that absent some compelling reason. So that's the argument in favor of ending the draft and going to an all-volunteer Army. And I'll add there's another reason. There's another advantage, and that is it leads to the professionalization of the military. And I've spoken to many people who have been in the military since 1973, in the military now. And to a person, I have not seen one who says, I think we ought to go back to the draft. Because the draftees are people who don't want to be there. At least they didn't choose to be there, and they're not going to make a career out of it, so they have no investment. Basically what they want to do is get in and out of the service as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. And those aren't the ones you want on the front lines, in the foxhole next to you. You want somebody who takes it as seriously as you do, people who are well-trained. War has changed, and so it's a lot harder to train people to use these new weapons systems in the short space of time that the draftees have. So that's another argument for having a volunteer military service and not to have draftees. But there is an important democratic argument against that. That is in favor of having a draft. And that is it focuses the mind of the country on these wars that are going on. The war in Vietnam was America's longest war until the war in Afghanistan. And America's longest war in the 1960s and 1970s ended because of popular protest against the war. Americans said, enough of this. We don't want to keep fighting there. There has been no comparable protest. against the war in Afghanistan. And this primarily because nobody is being forced to go to Afghanistan. The soldiers who are fighting in Afghanistan are soldiers who essentially have chosen to be in the military, in some cases chosen to be in Afghanistan. And so because there is no group that is saying, wait, we ought to think very carefully about this. It's much easier now for the people in government to say, yeah, just send the troops to Afghanistan, keep them there, because there's no protest against it. So wars can go on and on and on. And in fact, since the soldiers signed up to be there, presumably there's something that they like about being there. They don't want to get killed, but they like the combat pay and all this other stuff. So we've had this all-volunteer army for almost 50 years, but probably have it for a long time more. But it has its upsides and its downsides.